On May 19, 1536, at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, Anne Boleyn knelt on a low wooden scaffold at the Tower of London and prepared to die. The sword that would end her life had been imported from France, wielded by an executioner who had traveled across the Channel specifically for this moment. But what terrified Anne most in those final seconds was not the blade itself. It was the 17 days of psychological torment that had led her there. A carefully orchestrated campaign of terror so methodical that death became a release rather than a punishment. Because the story you've been told about Anne Boleyn's execution, the tale of a dignified queen meeting her fate with grace, is only half the truth. What they did to her before that sword fell was something far darker, something that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. Just 3 years earlier, in June 1533, Anne had walked through these same Tower grounds in triumph. She had been crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey in a spectacular ceremony that cost more than the king's annual military budget. Crowds had lined the streets, musicians played. The woman who had captivated Henry VIII and shattered his first marriage was now the most powerful woman in England. But by May 1536, everything had changed. The king who once moved heaven and earth to marry her had decided she needed to disappear, and in Tudor England, when a king wanted someone erased, he didn't simply kill them, he destroyed them systematically, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a body ready for burial. The campaign against Anne began long before she entered the Tower. By April 1536, whispers had started circulating through the court, accusations so outrageous they should have been dismissed immediately. Adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother, conspiracy to murder the king, witchcraft, incest. These charges were not just false, they were deliberately absurd, designed to be so shocking that the truth became irrelevant. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, had orchestrated every detail. He knew that destroying a queen required more than evidence. It required theater, spectacle, a story so grotesque that people would believe it simply because they couldn't imagine anyone inventing something so terrible. On May 2, 1536, Anne was arrested during a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace. She was not told why. She was not allowed to speak with her daughter, 3-year-old Elizabeth. Instead, she was immediately transported by barge to the Tower of London, passing beneath Traitor's Gate as a prisoner rather than a queen. The symbolism was deliberate. Everything that followed would be designed to strip away her dignity, her power, her very identity. When she arrived, Anne reportedly collapsed in tears, asking repeatedly what she had done wrong. The answer, of course, was nothing. But in Henry's court, innocence was no protection. Power demanded sacrifice, and Anne had become inconvenient. Inside the Tower, Anne was confined to the same apartments where she had prepared for her coronation. This was not coincidence. It was calculated cruelty, forcing her to exist in spaces filled with memories of triumph while awaiting death. Her ladies-in-waiting women, assigned by Cromwell, watched her constantly and reported every word she spoke. Anne had no privacy, no allies, no escape from the psychological pressure that mounted with each passing hour. She was allowed no visitors except her appointed chaplain. No letters could be sent or received. She existed in a vacuum of uncertainty, not knowing what was happening beyond her walls, not knowing when or even if she would be allowed to defend herself. The trial, held on May 15, 1536, was a formality rather than justice. Anne was not permitted legal counsel. The evidence against her consisted primarily of testimony extracted from terrified servants who knew their own survival depended on saying exactly what Cromwell wanted to hear. One man claimed to have witnessed her committing adultery through a keyhole, a physical impossibility given the layout of the rooms he described. Another testified that she had laughed at the king's poetry, which was somehow presented as evidence of treason. The proceedings lasted less than 3 hours. The verdict was predetermined. Anne Boleyn was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning or beheading, the method to be chosen by the king's mercy. If you're drawn to the real stories of history, the ones that don't appear in textbooks, where power destroys innocence behind closed doors and truth becomes whatever the powerful say it is, then subscribe to this channel, because what happened next reveals something deeply disturbing about justice, memory, and the cost of being a woman who dared to challenge a king. After the verdict, Anne was returned to her apartments to await execution. Her death was scheduled for May 17th, then suddenly postponed without explanation, then rescheduled for May 18th, then postponed again. This was not administrative confusion. It was psychological warfare. Each morning Anne woke believing she might die that day. Each night she went to sleep not knowing if she would see another dawn. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, forcing her to live inside her own execution over and over again, rehearsing it endlessly in her mind. Modern psychology recognizes this as a deliberate tactic designed to break the spirit completely. By the time death finally arrived, many victims welcomed it simply because the waiting had become unbearable. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest part of all. Henry VIII had transformed Anne's execution into something she would eventually beg for, not because she wanted to die, but because she could no longer endure the terror of waiting. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn woke before dawn after barely sleeping. Tower records show she requested the sacrament at 2 in the morning and remained kneeling in prayer for hours. clinging to ritual as the only certainty left in her collapsing world. By the time the lieutenant of the tower arrived to escort her to the scaffold, she had been awake for nearly 24 hours. Her body was exhausted. Her mind had fractured under the weight of sustained terror. Witnesses reported that she appeared almost cheerful, laughing with her ladies-in-waiting as she prepared to die. This was not courage, it was dissociation, the mind's final defense mechanism when survival is no longer possible. Her brain had detached from reality because reality had become too unbearable to process. The scaffold waiting for her on Tower Green was abnormally low, barely 3 feet high. Unlike the elevated platforms often depicted in films, this design was deliberate. It denied an embolic elevation, kept her face level with the crowd of nobles and officials assembled to watch. The structure itself was covered in black cloth, and fresh straw had been scattered across the surface to absorb blood. This was not Anne's first time seeing an execution scaffold. She had witnessed others die this way. She knew exactly what awaited her, and that knowledge must have been suffocating. As she climbed the shallow steps, her legs reportedly trembled so violently that her ladies had to steady her, but her voice, when she spoke, remained clear. Anne's final speech has been preserved in multiple accounts, though variations exist in the exact wording. She praised King Henry as a just and merciful ruler, thanked him for raising her from common birth to queenship, and asked the crowd to pray for the king. These words are often interpreted as grace or forgiveness, but the reality is far more tragic. Anne could not speak freely, even at the point of death. Everything she said would be reported back to Henry. Her 3-year-old daughter Elizabeth remained at court, her future entirely dependent on the king's goodwill. Anne's speech was not submission. It was a mother's final desperate attempt to protect her child by giving Henry no reason to punish Elizabeth further. Even in her last moments, she was denied truth. Even dying, she had to perform. Before kneeling, Anne removed her headdress and jewelry. Handing them to her ladies, she asked that her eyes be covered with a white blindfold, not out of fear but to prevent involuntary flinching that might cause the executioner to miss his mark. The blindfold served another purpose as well. It prevented her from seeing the sword's approach, which meant she would spend her final seconds in darkness, waiting for death without knowing precisely when it would come. That suspended instant, that waiting in absolute vulnerability, constitutes its own form of horror. Anne knelt upright in the French style rather than placing her head on a block, which required her to remain perfectly still through sheer willpower. Witnesses reported her lips moving constantly in prayer, her body rigid with tension. She was waiting, listening, trying to detect any sound or movement that might signal the sword's descent. The executioner had deliberately positioned himself several feet away, pretending to retrieve his weapon. Then, while Anne's attention was focused in that direction, he approached silently from behind and struck with devastating precision. The blade severed her head cleanly in a single blow, exactly as promised. By Tudor standards, this was considered merciful, but what followed shattered that illusion completely. Multiple witnesses recorded that after decapitation, Anne's eyes and lips continued to move for several seconds. This was not metaphor, it was physiology. Residual oxygen in the brain tissue allowed brief, horrifying movement even after the body had been destroyed. Some claimed her lips appeared to form words, perhaps the final syllables of prayer interrupted by steel. For those watching, the effect was deeply traumatic. Several spectators fainted, others turned away in visible distress. This moment, when the boundary between life and death blurred in the most grotesque way imaginable, revealed the execution for what it truly was. Not justice, not mercy, just violence dressed in ceremony. And then came perhaps the most revealing cruelty of all. There was no coffin waiting for Anne's remains. Despite weeks of planning, despite the imported executioner and the elaborate staging, no one had bothered to prepare a proper burial container for the former Queen of England. Her ladies-in-waiting, still shaking and grieving, were forced to search frantically for something suitable. They eventually found a wooden chest used for storing arrows. Into this crude box, Anne Boleyn's severed head and body were placed together and carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower walls. She was buried beneath the floor without proper ceremony, without a marker, without even a recorded location. This was not oversight. It was the final statement. Even in death, Anne was treated not as a human being worthy of dignity but as a resolved political problem, something to be disposed of quickly and forgotten completely. The same day Anne died, Henry VIII became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 11 days he married her in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. Life moved on. The problem had been solved. Anne's 3-year-old daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, removed from the line of succession, and left without appropriate clothing or household staff. The portraits of Anne were destroyed. Her symbols were torn from palace walls. Speaking her name became dangerous. The campaign to erase her from history had succeeded so completely that for centuries, even her burial location was unknown. It wasn't until 1876, during renovations of the chapel, that her remains were finally identified and properly marked. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of Anne Boleyn's execution is how thoroughly the truth was buried alongside her body. For generations, she was remembered primarily as the temptress who seduced a king, the adulteress who betrayed her marriage, the witch who deserved her fate. The propaganda that destroyed her life continued to define her death for centuries afterward. Only in recent decades have historians begun to reconstruct what actually happened, piecing together the evidence that reveals Anne not as a villain but as a victim of a systematic campaign of psychological destruction orchestrated by a king who had decided she was no longer useful. On that morning in May 1536, when the sword fell and Anne Boleyn's life ended, she was 35 years old. She had been Queen of England for exactly 1,000 days, and in those final 17 days inside the Tower, she endured a form of torture that left no visible marks but destroyed her just as thoroughly as any physical violence could. The real horror of Anne Boleyn's execution was not the blade. It was the waiting, the isolation, the systematic dismantling of hope. It was the psychological warfare that transformed death into mercy and silence into survival for everyone who witnessed what happens when power decides to destroy someone completely. Comment below and tell us, do you think Anne Boleyn's story would have been remembered differently if she had been a man? Because that question, perhaps more than any other, reveals why her execution still matters 500 years later.